Welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we're doing a guide for the Tol Dagor dungeon on Mythic.
Yes, this walkthrough should give you a solid idea on how to complete the dungeon on Mythic, but almost all the information translates well into much higher Mythic Plus keys. So let's jump straight in at the start of the instance.
Upon zoning into the dungeon, you'll find yourself on a beach next to the prison. You want to start to clear your way towards the open sewer pipe. Vicejaw Crocolisks will bite down on the tank with a massive chomp. This deals a burst of physical damage and reduces the tank's maximum health by 5% for 12 seconds. This isn't noticeable until fighting a large amount of them because it stacks up pretty fast. Be careful when pulling them or just be ready to kite to allow the debuff to drop. As for the silk crabs, they're found in groups. They will cast Squeeze on a random player within 10 yards of them, dealing damage and rooting them for 6 seconds. They do, however, have a habit of casting on the same target simultaneously. Take care when pulling many of these guys and have your group stacked near them to try and spread the squeeze to multiple players. Swarms of stinging parasites will patrol along the beach, and all they do is just apply dots to nearby players, but they have so little health, you can just nuke them down fast. Now, before engaging the very first boss, the Sand Queen, try and clear as much of the area around her as possible, because otherwise you're going to be pulling it during the fight.
Now the Sand Queen will spawn several sand traps near players. Running into them will deal a burst of damage, knock up and stun you for 4 seconds. Many of these spawn over time, so just do your best to keep clear of them. You might need to move the boss around as traps spawn just to keep it clear for melee. Each trap also spawns a buzzing drone. These guys act the same as the stinging parasites, applying dots to nearby players. When a buzzing drone dies, they will enrage the boss, increasing damage done and haste by 5% for 4 seconds, and this can stack. You need to either quickly kill the buzzing drones and then soothe the buff off the boss, or just wait until she casts Upheaval. The Sand Queen will burrow under the ground before marking a player for Upheaval. Moments later, the boss will appear under that location, dealing damage and knocking up all nearby players. The target of Upheaval cannot avoid the damage, but the rest of the group can. Killing drones during this time should make the buff drop before she re-emerges. Now the boss will also occasionally summon a sandstorm, dealing damage and pushing all players in a direction. This is unavoidable, just run against it and make sure you're away from traps. After defeating the Sand Queen, proceed into the open sewer pipe. As you move through the pipe, you will disturb the garbage on the ground, spawning packs of stinging parasites. Continuing further up the pipe will lead the group into a large room with many sewer vicejaws. When inside the prison, this next area can be shortened by having your rogues lockpick gates. This may save you some time in Mythic Plus. Make sure you interrupt the thug's debilitating shout. This will deal a burst of magic damage and debuff players, reducing all damage done by 50%. Blacktooth Arsonists will hit the tank with Torch Strike, dealing a burst of damage and applying a magic dispellable dot. Healers dispel this. Looters will cast Dark Step, teleporting to the tank and gaining a 50% haste increase. Make sure you purge this off. Large packs of these looters are best dealt with by using Master Spell or Arcane Torrent. Whilst fighting Sea Speakers, ignore interrupting the Sea Blast cast at the tank and focus on the watery dome instead. This causes all nearby mobs to take 75% less damage and applies an absorption shield, but this effect can be dispelled if you fuck up the interrupt. When you reach the floor which houses Jess Howlis, we recommend that you clear most, if not all, of the trash on the floor. This is because the boss will run around the entire floor during the encounter, pulling any trash that you skipped on the way to him.
Now Howlis' most impactful ability is Flashing Daggers. After the 6-second cast, the boss will deal a near lethal amount of damage and knock back all players within line of sight. All players within the group just need to hide behind a nearby pillar to ensure they're not hit by the ability. When the boss casts Howling Fear, make sure you interrupt it. This cast will fear all players for 6 seconds. Using line of sight does not work on this ability. On top of this, the boss will also target a random player and throw a crippling shiv at them after a short cast. This player will take a burst of damage and gain a poison dot that slows their movement speed. You want to dispel this if possible. Upon reaching 50% health, the boss will throw down some smoke powder, stunning the entire group for 6 seconds. The boss will then proceed to run along the catwalk around the edges of the room, opening up cells as he goes. Each cell contains an Irontide Raider ad. The tank will need to pick up these ads one by one. Jess will, however, release Bobby Howlis from the last cell. Bobby will cast Howling Fear just like Jess does. You need to make sure you interrupt it. But most importantly, when Bobby casts Vicious Mauling, players need to instantly swap to him and burst him down, as he will be on top of a player, stunning them and dealing damage over 30 seconds, while also gaining an absorption shield which prevents interrupts during this time. The moment you've removed the shield, you can interrupt them all. Once Jess reaches the end of the catwalk, he will begin to channel Motivating Cry. This is a 45-second channel where he will just simply apply a stacking damage increase on himself. Now there are two ways of dealing with this. You can either instantly interrupt it and deal with the boss and the ads and Bobby all at the exact same time, where you have to interrupt both Howling Fear casts, which can be pretty difficult. However, it will allow you to kill the boss a lot quicker. Or you can let the 45-second channel finish, Meanwhile, you kill off Bobby, and as soon as the boss is active again, you can simply purge the buff off him. Alternatively, if you've got crazy high damage, or perhaps you're doing a very low key, you could probably just let the motivating cry channel go on, while you just nuke the living hell out of Jess while making sure that you interrupt Bobby's howl, and hopefully Jess will die before his channel finishes. Once Jess is dead, you can then head through the rest of the prison. Ashvane jailers will buff themselves in any trash within 10 yards when they channel Riot Shield. This reduces all incoming damage by 75% and redirects all spells back to the player that cast them, so casters need to stop damage on them. Tanks you'll just need to move the trash mobs out of the zone to remove the effect. However, you can use AoE stuns or displacements to interrupt the shield. You'll want to make sure that you interrupt the Ashvane officers when they cast Handcuff on a random player. This will deal ticking damage, pacify, silence, and slow movement speeds on that player. The officers also have access to the Riot Shield, so you'll need to deal with it just like you did on the jailers. The Marines cast Suppression Fire on the tank. This long cast will fire a frontal cone, dealing damage and applying a dot. Make sure you face them away from the group. Aside from casting Blaze, which just bursts damage on a random player, the Flamecasters will also cast Fuse Lighter at a random player, marking their location. A few moments later, this area will explode, dealing large damage to anyone stood within it. You'll want to make sure that you interrupt both these casts. Now, the single Ashvane spotter casts Suppression Fire just like the Marines, however they will ignite a single munitions barrel that lays in front of them. You want to make sure that you move out the clearly indicated munitions barrel explosion radius before it explodes, as otherwise they're going to take massive damage. Once you reach the outer walkway, you'll see the heavy cannons for the first time. These neutral mobs can be mounted by right-clicking on them. Inside you can use the Cannon Blast ability. This deals incredibly high bursts of damage and knocks back anything within its targeting zone. This includes other players. Due to the knockback from the blast, the heavy cannon can be used to annihilate trash packs in this particular area of the instance, and early on in the expansion it probably will be quicker just to use the cannons and let ranged DPS kill the trash, while melee just sit back and wait. After clearing the area, you'll come to Knight Captain Valerie.
At the beginning of the encounter, you can find 4 munition barrels in a relatively small encounter space. If the munition barrels are hit by any form of fire damage, they will explode after 6 seconds. This deals near lethal fire damage to all players within 20 yards, whilst also dealing damage to other barrels within 20 yards. This can set off a chain reaction, as each explosion causes another barrel to explode, and after they explode, another barrel will appear in the encounter space to ensure that there are always 4 barrels in play. To prevent the munition barrels from exploding, you can right-click them to pick them up. Whilst carrying them, your movement speed is reduced and you are pacified. You want to move them from incoming damage and then place them on the ground by using your extra action button. This needs to be done throughout the fight, and players must be careful to not allow a barrel to explode in the middle of the encounter space, as it leaves little to no room for the group to safely stand in. When ignition is cast, zones will appear underneath the locations of players or munition barrels. After around 15 seconds, these zones will explode, dealing near lethal damage to players and igniting the barrels within the zones. Use this 15-second window to move the barrels around. The boss will also cast Cinder Flame in the direction of a randomly selected munition barrel. After a 7-second cast, a large frontal cone of fire will spew out in that direction the boss was facing, dealing damage and igniting any barrels within the area. Just move the barrels out of the zone if possible, and do note that barrels towards the end of the cone might be difficult to save. Valerie will also apply a dispellable dot to a random player when she casts Fuse Lighter. If that player is handling a barrel during this time, the barrel will drop to the floor and ignite. This debuff should be dispelled as soon as possible, and the player afflicted by the debuff should avoid handling any barrels until the debuff is removed. Although it is possible to do the encounter without a single barrel exploding, which in fact is an achievement for the boss, it is likely that the barrels will explode during the fight. The group just needs to do their best to ensure that the explosions do not chain off each other, as this can leave very little room for the group to actually dodge the boss's abilities. Once the Knight Captain has been slain, head towards the final boss. On the way there, you'll encounter Ashvane Wardens, which will frequently gain the heavily armed buff, increasing their damage dealt by 100%, but reducing their movement speed by 50%. If you're struggling on these guys as a tank, just kite them around. These Wardens will also cast Lockdown. This will deal a burst of damage and root all players within 6 yards for 4 seconds. Just move from them the moment this is cast. When Ashvane Priest casts Righteous Flames, move from them. This deals a burst of damage to all players within 8 yards, as well as applying a magic debuff which disorients you, dealing additional ticking damage. The Inner Flames cast is interruptible, and if this cast does go through, it will buff all nearby trash, healing them and increasing their damage done, which of course is really bad. The group will have access to more heavy cannons during this time. Utilizing these cannons can quickly dispose of both the Wardens and the Priests. Again, just watch out for your allies. After doing that, now it's the time for the last boss, Overseer Corgus.
Now the boss will periodically buff himself throughout the fight with 2 different Azerite rounds. Incendiary rounds cause all of the boss's abilities to apply a dot to any player who takes damage from a mechanic. This hurts, so healers you need to really be on top of your game. As for the blast rounds, they'll cause all the boss's abilities to knock you back. This is potentially problematic as you can be knocked into other abilities. Now Overseer Korguz will create several cone-shaped zones around him when he casts Cross Ignition. Anyone who remains within these zones at the end of the cast will take a near lethal amount of damage. You need to make sure you react quickly and just stand between them. Additionally, Korguz will also mark several players in the group with Explosive Burst. After 4 seconds, these players will explode, dealing damage to themselves and anyone within 5 yards. Note that this is one of the only abilities that you cannot dodge, so if blast rounds are active, be ready to be knocked back. Another deadly ability that the boss has is Deadeye. He'll target a random player and then just send out a projectile towards them that will focus them down. The first person that soaks the projectile will absorb it, taking a large burst of damage and receive a lengthy debuff which increases the damage you take from the next projectile by 500%. So what you need to do is rotate a different player each time to soak this ability, so no one gets one shot. Whilst all of this is going on, there is also a cannon around the edge of the encounter space that will periodically face a direction and begin to charge up a massive blast. This cast deals damage and knocks back anyone within a cone. Make sure you move away from the front of the cannon to avoid getting hit. The last thing to mention is the alternate energy bar that you have. This bar will fill up with energy whenever you move, and the only way it will drop is when you stand still. If the bar fills up to 100%, you'll be stunned for 8 seconds while the bar resets back to 0. As a result, you need to restrict your movement as much as possible, saving it for times where you actually need to move from a mechanic. But if you can get the hang of that and you can dodge all the abilities, that's pretty much all you need to know for this encounter, and that wraps up Tol Dagor.
Thanks for watching, guys. If this guide helped you out, then let us know by putting down a like. And for more information on strategies for this instance's trash and bosses, then do check out our guide over on Wowhead. These guys are updated frequently, so make sure you check them out. And before we do go, a big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. We really do appreciate the support, so thank you so much. And of course, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.